Our big question is, what makes a life good? And you might think that the best way of answering this question would be to just go ask some good people. If you wanted to know what it means to coach well, you'd probably just ask a good coach. If you want to know what makes a life good, why not ask someone with a good life? There's something to this strategy, and it's one we'll explore at some length today. But it also raises some thorny questions, and we'll need to draw on the resources of philosophy to untangle them. Sometimes the best way to identify what you're looking for is to just point to it. So instead of describing some object in exhaustive detail, I can just say, this is the thing that I want. This pointing strategy can be good when we're doing philosophy too. When it comes to our big question, you might start out by simply identifying those figures, perhaps people throughout history, who have lived arguably exceptional lives. These might be heroes from religious faith, people like Jesus or the Buddha. They might be folks who made a great difference in their societies, people like Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr. or Mother Teresa. Or it might be exceptionally creative or innovative people like Steve Jobs. What if we could just come up with a list of such figures and ask what they had to say about what makes a life good? Unfortunately, things are complicated, and this strategy faces three major problems. Problem number one, it's not clear who exactly should be counted as a moral role model, and in what respects. Mother Teresa is a great example here. Most of us agree that she was generally a very good person. Many of us think she was a genuine saint. But some have argued that in providing food and shelter for the poorest of the poor in India, she was actually propping up a fundamentally unjust system, and that she really wasted her efforts when she could have been fighting for systematic political change. If we can't even agree on who the genuine moral heroes are, then the strategy under consideration, the pointing strategy, doesn't seem like it's going to help us make much progress on the question we started with. Here's a second problem. Even when it is clear that someone deserves a place on the list, it's not always clear in what respects they are morally praiseworthy and in what respects they weren't. Steve Jobs, for instance, was a visionary. Some might even argue a genius. And the technology he developed has had a tremendous impact in the world. But he's also been severely criticized for the way that he treated his employees, those he did business with, and even his own family members. The point is not that good people aren't complicated. But if we can't determine whether a moral hero's tendency to seek out publicity stems from vanity or for genuine moral concern, it won't be easy for us to determine the respects in which we should imitate them, and those in which we shouldn't. Finally, there are often big moral differences and disagreements between those who are thought to uncontroversially deserve the title of moral hero. The Buddha, for instance, thinks our goal should be to eliminate all appearances of a self, whereas Christ thinks the whole purpose of life is to have yourself exist eternally with God. If our role models can't agree about these basic moral questions, how can we expect them to provide unified teachings on what makes a life good? These are real problems, and they show the limits of the strategy we're considering. But they don't undermine it completely. Consider the following analogy. If you want to know how to coach football well, you might start by making a list of the greatest coaches of all time. But of course, there are disagreements about who belongs on this list, about how to rank them and why. And there are a number of incompatibilities between their various coaching styles. Now, some of these differences are merely superficial, in which case they don't really undermine the strategy in question. But some of them are real deep differences, and they just show that there's often more than one way to reach a particular goal. We should be careful then to distinguish between superficial differences and points of deep disagreement. The same goes for questions about who's a role model in the first place. There's certainly room for disagreement and criticism, but a lack of perfect certainty doesn't mean that we can't find any uncontroversial role models, or that we can't make progress by looking at the lives of those we take to be genuine role models. Moving on to our last, most difficult problem. What should we do when role models actually disagree about some key teaching about the good life? We recommend approaching this question in much the way that you would approach any important issue on which experts disagree. First, take a look for yourself. Use your moral sensibilities to sort through the disagreement by looking closely at the details of that particular moral hero's life and asking whether you think the teaching comes out of a deep lived virtue or whether it might just be an assumption that they held unreflectively. Second, draw on the moral sensibilities and resources of your communities and traditions. If you're religious, for instance, ask whether the teaching is in accord with the truth as you think it's been revealed. Or see what people you respect think about it, and use this to help orient yourself on the question. Finally, you might take a step back and recognize that there are at least some claims that nearly all of the purported moral heroes would endorse. That we should always act with the good of others in mind, for instance, or that we should avoid cruelty and vice. The deep agreement among moral role models can serve as a solid foundation for us in our attempt to determine what makes a life good. And even the disagreements can serve as a jumping-off point. This last point is worth emphasizing. Remember that answering the question of what makes a life good is something you've ultimately got to do for yourself. So while role models can be helpful in this respect, they can't do everything for you. By using this strategy in combination with the others, you'll surely make progress toward the ultimate goal of determining what your values are and bringing your life into systematic alignment with them.